There were nights it wouldn't let me sleep. Something would knock. Something cold sat at the foot of my bed. That's how Jim O'Connor, a cadet at West Point in 1972, began his story. Not with theatrics. Not with fear in his voice. Just a calm, steady tone, like someone describing a memory that had refused to die. You could tell he'd carried it for years. That sentence, "Something cold sat at the foot of my bed," doesn't fade when you hear it. It lingers. It invites a question you're not sure you want answered. What was it that waited in the dark? Room 4714 wasn't supposed to be different. Just another numbered space in Scott Barracks, indistinguishable from the dozens of other cadet quarters lining the 4th floor. But almost immediately, something about it felt wrong. Cadets noticed the temperature, how it never matched the rest of the building. They heard quiet tapping in the walls, even when the pipes weren't running. Sometimes they'd swear someone was walking just behind them. But when they turned, there was only silence. Then came the figure. Not a rumor. Not a joke. Multiple cadets described seeing the same man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in what looked like an old cavalry coat, standing motionless at the end of the hall. He never moved. He never spoke. He was just there. Until he wasn't. The sightings grew more frequent. Doors opened on their own. Drafts moved through sealed windows. One cadet claimed he saw his reflection blink when he hadn't. And slowly, jokes about the ghost guard faded into something colder. Requests for reassignment increased. Cadets avoided the room. Leadership didn't make statements, but one day, without announcement, room 4714 was sealed. No new assignments. No explanations. Just a door, locked and left behind. And that's where this story begins, not with a scream, but with a whisper the Academy never wanted echoed. Because while West Point has trained some of the most fearless leaders in American history, even here, in a place built on order and reason, there are places you're told not to go. And room 4714? It's not just a room anymore. It's what happens when something ancient slips through the cracks and waits for someone brave enough, or unlucky enough, to walk in. Since 1802, the United States Military Academy at West Point has stood as a symbol of excellence, unyielding discipline, honor, and the relentless shaping of America's future leaders. Every inch of its stone walls carries weight. Its alumni have led troops into wars, commanded global forces, and shaped history with both conviction and consequence. To wear the uniform there isn't just an achievement, it's a transformation. It means you've committed your life to something bigger, something that demands everything and returns only a silent nod of respect. West Point isn't a place for superstition, it's a place for grit. And yet, even institutions built on logic and order have shadows, whispers, unspoken truths. Beneath that sharp exterior of drills and doctrine lies a quieter current, a legacy just as old, but rarely admitted. Some cadets have spoken of unmarked graves tucked behind the older structures, of phantom footsteps trailing them during evening watch. There's an old cemetery near the academy grounds, and every now and then, a story resurfaces, a flicker of movement at night, a cadet refusing to walk a certain hall alone. These moments don't appear in the curriculum, but they exist. Scott Barracks, in the 1970s, was alive with that kind of tension. It was the pulse of daily cadet life, waking before dawn, training until you break, memorizing every step of tradition. And tucked inside its 4th floor, room 4714 seemed just another number. Just another doorway in a long hallway. But something changed there. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. For the few cadets unlucky enough to be assigned that room, where Transformation West Point is known for, took a darker, stranger turn. One that no leadership manual could explain, and no one wanted to talk about twice. Jim O'Connor didn't believe in ghosts. Not then. Not when he arrived at West Point in the fall of 1972 as a wide-eyed plebe, exhausted from drills, stripped of identity, and determined to make his mark. Like every other cadet, he was trained to dismiss distraction, suppress fear, and obey logic over instinct. But within weeks of moving into room 4714, something began to chip away at that certainty. Quiet at first. Almost dismissible. A faint scratching near the base of the wall at night, like something with fingernails dragging slowly across concrete. He mentioned it to his roommate, half laughing. They both shrugged it off. Maybe the pipes, maybe mice. This place was old. That made sense. But then the cold came. Not the kind of chill that leaks through windows or sinks in after a long day outside. No, this was something else. A drop in temperature so sharp it felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. Jim would wake shivering, even under 2 layers of wool. At first, he blamed fatigue, stress, even his own imagination. Until one night, he heard the latch click. Slowly. Then, the door creaked open. No knock. No footsteps. Just opening. He sat up, fully alert now, every muscle tensed. What stood in the doorway wasn't a roommate or prankster. It was a man, or something like one, dressed in what looked like faded cavalry gear, head tilted slightly downward, hands clenched. The figure didn't speak, didn't move toward him, just stood at the threshold as if it had every right to be there. Then it turned, and without a sound, walked straight through the solid wall to its left. Jim didn't scream. He didn't move. He just sat there, heart thundering, the room colder than ever. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. It wasn't just Jim. That's what unsettled everyone the most. His story, strange as it sounded, didn't stand alone. Quiet murmurs began to ripple across the floor, then the building. Cadets in rooms nearby, no nonsense, hard-edged men trained to dismiss emotion, started admitting things they couldn't explain. One said he heard faint commands, barked low and stern, echoing from the hallway long after lights out. No footsteps, no voices, just a voice that didn't belong. Another cadet, known for being grounded and skeptical, swore he saw a man in a long, outdated dress coat walk into the supply closet and never come out. He laughed it off at first, said it had to be someone messing with him. But when he checked, when he opened that door, the closet was empty. No back exit. No hiding place. Just air that felt colder than it should have been. That's when the pattern emerged. Cold spots that clung to one side of the room. Electrical malfunctions in rooms that had never had issues before. Cadets waking up with bruises they couldn't explain, on wrists, on ankles. Some said they felt held down in their sleep. One refused to stay another night and requested to be moved. He didn't offer details. He just said, "It's not a place for the living." Rumors caught fire. The commandant issued a formal warning: stop spreading ghost stories. Focus on the mission. But you can't silence fear, not when it's shared. And behind closed doors, everyone knew something had shifted in room 4714, and none of them could unsee it. Jim didn't remember falling asleep that night. He just remembered the cold. A kind of cold that didn't feel like air conditioning or open windows. It felt intentional. It wrapped around him like a grip, tight and sudden, and then came the pull. At first, he thought it was a dream. The blanket tugged down slowly from his chest to his waist. Then harder. He sat up. And in the half-darkness, before he could even process what was happening, a force slammed into him. Not gentle. Not subtle. His back hit the floor with a thud that echoed in the silence. He didn't cry out. Not because he wasn't scared, but because fear, when it reaches a certain level, goes quiet. It freezes you. His roommate shot up at the same time, breath caught in his throat. Later, he would swear he saw something. Someone, standing over Jim's bed in that split second. Tall. Still. Watching. But by the time Jim scrambled to his feet, there was nothing. The room looked exactly as it always had. And yet, not one piece of him believed they'd imagined it. What do you do when everything you've been trained to believe, logic, control, composure, collapses in a moment you can't explain? You move. That same night, both cadets requested to be transferred out of 4714. No arguments. No questions. Just urgency. And quietly, Without statement or ceremony, the room was sealed. For good. No new cadets assigned. No explanations given. Just silence. But Jim would carry that moment for the rest of his life. Because when something touches you in the dark, when it chooses you, that room stops being a place. It becomes a memory you can't ever shut the door on. A week after the incident, the silence around room 4714 broke, but not from inside West Point. It came from the outside, in black ink and newsprint. On November 21, 1972, the New York Times published a story that caught more than a few people off guard. It wasn't front-page material, but it didn't need to be. The headline mentioned a ghost guard. And buried within the paragraphs was something rare: confirmation that cadets were reporting cold drafts, disappearing figures, and nights of unexplained fear. For a place like West Point, rooted in tradition, discipline, and control, that kind of story wasn't just odd. It was disruptive. What made it even more unsettling was how quickly the story spread, quietly but widely. Alumni began making phone calls. Parents wrote letters. And cadets, already on edge, suddenly realized their whispers weren't confined to the dormitories anymore. Something about seeing it printed in the nation's most respected paper made it feel real, tangible. If the New York Times was asking questions, maybe this wasn't just stress or superstition. Maybe something really had stepped across the line between reality and belief. West Point never issued an official response. No denials, no clarifications. But behind closed doors, the reaction was different. Doors were checked more often. Cadet rotations were adjusted. And room 4714? It was left untouched. Not out of fear, but perhaps something deeper. Respect, maybe. Or caution. Because once a place crosses into legend, it's no longer just a room. It's a mirror. A test of what you believe and what you're willing to dismiss. And for the first time, the institution that taught future generals to master the battlefield was staring into something it couldn't outmaneuver. Silently and very much aware. The article came and went. The whispers never did. You would think, after national coverage, West Point would issue a statement, deny it, deflect it, explain it away. But that day never came. No official words. No formal closure. Just silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's calculated, controlled. As if someone decided that the best way to bury a story was to starve it of oxygen. But stories like this don't die. They evolve. And the more West Point refused to speak, the more cadets kept talking. Years passed. New classes entered Scott Barracks, unaware at first. But tradition has its own way of spreading. Quiet jokes during orientation, rumors passed down like coded warnings. Room 4714 became a name cadets whispered at night when the halls went still. And if you were brave or foolish, someone might dare you to knock. Some cadets say the door's been changed. Others claim it's been sealed shut, permanently dark. On some unofficial floor plans, the room doesn't exist at all. As if erasing it from the map could erase what happened there. But it couldn't. The opposite happened. The silence gave it weight. What was once a strange experience shared by a few became legend, etched into the culture like an unspoken rite of passage. Cadets still ask, even now, is it true? And behind every quiet answer is a choice. Believe the institution that stayed quiet, or trust the voices that never could. No one has stayed in room 4714 since. And no one ever will. Not because they can't, but because somewhere deep down, they already know the answer. West Point isn't a place for fragile minds. The pressure, the expectations, the sheer psychological weight of becoming a soldier there, it breaks some, reshapes others, and hardens most. So when people hear stories about ghosts in room 4714, it's natural to ask the question, was it all just stress? Could plebes, sleep-deprived and stretched thin, have conjured something that wasn't really there? Maybe. Maybe the mind can reach a breaking point and invent shadows just to cope with the ones already inside. But what about the cold? Not emotional coldness, real, physical drops in temperature. What about doors opening on their own, blankets ripped from cadets in the middle of the night, bodies shoved out of bed with no visible force? Hallucinations don't leave bruises. Group hysteria doesn't move furniture. Some skeptics still cling to the idea that it was all an elaborate prank passed down from year to year, older cadets testing the mental resilience of the new ones. But that theory unravels fast. Too many stories. Too many identical descriptions. Too many people who never spoke to each other recounting the same face in the dark. Then there are the believers. The ones who say the spirit belonged to a cavalry officer who died on the grounds long before Scott Barracks ever stood. Others point to fatal accidents during the Civil War, suggesting the trauma of those deaths never really left. But even those theories fall short of explaining why room 4714. Why only that room? Jim O'Connor has heard every theory. He doesn't entertain them. When asked, he speaks clearly, without drama. It wasn't my imagination, he says. And maybe that's the most haunting part. Not the ghost, not the room, but the unshakable certainty in a man who's spent 50 years trying to forget, and still can't. Nearly 40 years later, Jim O'Connor sat down in front of a camera, not with theatrics or a need for attention, but with the kind of steadiness that only time can sharpen. It was 2011. The world had changed. West Point had changed, but the memory hadn't. In a quiet, unsensational voice, he walked viewers through what happened in room 4714. Every detail matched what he'd said decades earlier. The cold, the figure, the shove. There was no script, no sensational claims. Just a man telling the same story he'd carried in silence for most of his life. And the internet listened. The comment section filled fast, not with mockery, but recognition. Alumni who had passed through Scott Barracks in the years after chimed in. "I remember hearing whispers about that room," one wrote. Another claimed to have seen the door sealed, taped off as if forgotten by time on purpose. One anonymous comment stood out, calm, unverified, and chilling. Asterisk, "It's still locked. Because what's in there never left." Asterisk. In the years that followed, the story caught fire again. More channels began covering it, piecing together fragments from interviews, podcasts, and archived posts. By 2021, room 4714 was trending once more, especially during Halloween, when military lore and ghost stories blur into one. But the attention didn't change Jim. He wasn't chasing fame. He never embellished. If anything, the retelling gave weight to something far more powerful than fear. Truth told quietly, without needing to be believed. And in a world where legends usually fade, this one did the opposite. It sharpened. Because when a man speaks the same truth across decades, people eventually stop asking if it happened, and start asking why it hasn't stopped. Every institution has its myths. But at West Point, where every brick feels like it remembers something, myths become markers. Cadets still talk about room 4714. Not formally, not in classes or briefings, but in the quiet spaces in between. Late nights. Long marches. The kind of moments when truth feels a little softer, and courage isn't always about what you face in combat. It's whispered now as a dare. Knock 3 times, they say. Wait in the silence. Some claim the door vibrates slightly afterward. Others swear they heard breathing. But always, always asterisk, it's just talk. No one opens the door. And maybe that's the point. Every few years, someone asks about it. A plebe, still fresh, curious. A paranormal researcher reaching for an interview. A visiting alumnus wondering aloud whether it's still locked. The answers come gently, shrugs, sidesteps, laughter that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Because there's a difference between forgetting something and knowing it's better left untouched. That door isn't just wood and paint. It's a threshold, a boundary between what the academy can explain and what it never could. But more than anything, room 4714 has become a mirror. It doesn't just represent a haunting. It represents the tension between discipline and fear, control and chaos. Every cadet at West Point is trained to endure, to lead, to confront the unknown. But some unknowns don't march, don't yield, and don't answer to rank. That room is still there, quiet, locked, unchanged. And if you walk past it, you may not hear a sound. But many say the room feels like it's watching, as if it remembers you, even if you don't remember it. And that's what makes it powerful. Not just the story it holds, but the ones it never tells. What really happened in room 4714? That question still hangs in the air like breath on a cold night. Visible, real, but gone the moment you reach for it. Was it the mind under pressure? A shared hallucination shaped by stress, isolation, and the weight of tradition? Or was it something older? Something left behind by war, by loss, by the kind of pain that doesn't fade with time. The kind that lingers, watches, waits. Some believe it was a test. Not by the academy, but by something unseen. A test of what you believe when no one's watching, when you're alone in the dark and silence wraps itself around your throat. What do you cling to when your training fails to explain the cold pressing down on your chest? Who do you become when the rules no longer fit the world around you? One fact remains, steady and unshaken. Since 1972, no one has spent the night in that room. It's never been reassigned, never reopened. And that silence, the decades-long absence of any new story, is louder than any scream. Ask the cadets there today. Most will shrug. Some will smile. But if you listen closely, you'll notice something else. They won't say the room's number aloud. Not directly. As if naming it might summon it back. As if the memory is still alive, still waiting behind that door. So maybe the real question isn't what happened. Maybe it's why the story never disappeared. And why, even after all these years, one empty room in a school built on certainty still holds a power no one can explain, and no one dares to challenge. Maybe that's the point. Some things aren't meant to be solved, only remembered, quietly, carefully, and never alone. So now it's your turn to stand at the threshold, just like those cadets once did. What do you think happened in room 4714? Was it the pressure, the isolation, the razor-sharp edge of becoming a soldier? Or was it something else entirely? Something no uniform or training manual could prepare them for. Maybe it wasn't just a haunting. Maybe it was a warning. A trace of pain so old it became its own presence. Watching, waiting, testing. Do you believe stories like this are just echoes, or can they be something more? Something alive. We're drawn to stories that don't have easy answers, because they speak to a part of us that logic can't reach, the part that still wonders what moves in the dark after the lights go out. And that's why this matters. Not because ghosts make for good entertainment, but because the unexplained forces us to listen, not just with facts, but with feeling. West Point has trained generations of warriors. It has conquered every test, every challenge, except this one. A door they still haven't reopened. A question they still haven't answered. And that's where you come in. If you've heard whispers, other military stories that defy reason, experiences passed down through barracks, bases, or battlefields, we want to hear them. What other stories have been left behind in the shadows of service? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is part of this search. Because every time someone tells a story, the silence loses a little of its grip. And if you're drawn to these moments, the ones history doesn't write down but refuses to forget, subscribe and stay close. We're just getting started. There are more doors, more stories, and sometimes, the most dangerous enemy doesn't carry a weapon. Sometimes, it doesn't even breathe.